this lecture, we are going to look at the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. Since this is an architect well known to most of us, that's been covered also in HD2 extensively, in this lecture I'd like to highlight some of the influences on Frank Lloyd Wright and how we see those articulated in his work. Now sometimes when we talk about an architect and their influence, there's a pretty clear one-for-one relationship between, say, a material or a teaching or an influence and the work that they produce. Other times, it's less tangible. In the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, it's kind of a mix. So let's see what we find here. Frank Lloyd Wright often portrayed himself as a heroic loner, but we know that he was not a cultural hermit. We know from his writings that Wright was a keen observer of the natural and cultural landscape of his time. He was a highly disciplined artist who had an extraordinary ability to understand both the goals of architectural design and the means by which they could be addressed. His unique synthesis of architectural design is built upon sources to which he was exposed and that he actively sought out. His intuition was developed as a critical response to his environment and not in spite of it. As Vincent Scully points out, Wright's work was directly and indirectly influenced by all the architectures he studied. However, Wright often refused to acknowledge this fact. So the recognition of diverse influence in Wright's work should in no way diminish the significance of his architecture or your admiration for his accomplishments. These same sources were available to other architects who lacked his capacity to assimilate them into a personal vision. An understanding of these influences helps us to better appreciate Wright's virtuosity. During his lifetime, Frank Lloyd Wright assimilated many influences, and one of the earliest of these, which is believed to have had a lasting effect on him, was the kindergarten method of Friedrich Froebel. Wright's mother introduced him to Froebel's ideas and to Froebelian toys. These consisted of geometric blocks to assemble in different ways, encouraging the child's sense of three-dimensional composition, which allowed the child's perception of planar elements to develop. In his early career, Wright constructed buildings with a definite geometric clarity, such as the Winslow House in River Forest. The Froebel toys undoubtedly led the way to this type of design, so advanced for its time. In the 1890s, most other architects were still reviving past styles. Neoclassical was especially popular, but not Frank Lloyd Wright. A bit about Froebel. After he died in 1852, his revolutionary Garden for Children, or kindergarten, spread to American shores, where in 1870 its impressive, progressive-minded mothers like Anna Wright. Through her architect son, we can see how these teachings had a direct influence. In fact, in this case, Frank Lloyd Wright even mentioned the influence of his mother and of this particular teaching tool. Wright's mother's intense interest in the Froebel system started at the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876. When she was there, she found these gifts, which were the manipulables, or these objects, that were part of Froebel's kindergarten exhibit there. Along with the gifts was a system as a basis for design and the elementary geometry behind all sort of learning pre-mathematics and pre-spatial understanding. His mother learned that Friedrich Froebel taught children to not look from just casual appearances of nature, but rather to master the basic forms lying hidden underneath appearances. So cosmic geometric elements were what should first be made visible to the child's mind. Quoting from Wright's autobiography, quote, "The virtue of all this lay in the awakening of the child mind to rhythmic structure in nature, giving the child a sense of innate cause and effect otherwise far beyond child comprehension. I soon became susceptible to construction patterns, evolving in everything I saw. I learned to see this way, and when I did not care to draw casual incidentals to nature. I wanted to design." Unquote. In the next couple of projects, we can see in the massing and organization that clear sensibility of geometry and of the blocks. In fact, people have gone back and built these buildings using Froebel blocks as a sort of test. A bit of fun. This is Wright's first major public work. It's an administrative building for the Larkin Mail Order Company of Buffalo, New York. The Larkin embodies Wright's vision of productive labor as a cornerstone of the social contract. And as you can see in the right image, the central space of the building is filled with an almost ecclesiastical light. And it also is ringed with inscriptions extolling the values of labor. Like the Prairie Houses, the Larkin building reveals Wright's interest in the built environment as a fully designed work of art. He designed the desks, chairs, lights, and windows specifically for this building, with each part eloquently taking its place within the complete ensemble. The Larkin building also represents a technological advance. It is one of the first air-conditioned buildings in America. Cooled and filtered air was provided to protect the building's important documents from the coal soot emitted by tall rail lines and nearby factories. And here you can see some other images, and there the Larkin, the Froebel blocks assembled to look like the Larkin building. In the right image we see again that skylit central area. The building was for the administrative staff of the Larkin Soap Manufacturing Company, a mail order company. And so you had a pool of people answering the phones in this area taking orders. And what Wright wanted to do, and I think we can see this quite well, is to create a modern building that would give the workers a sense of what he called a family gathering place. Unity Temple, which is Frank Lloyd Wright's only surviving public building from the Prairie period, also shows us that rigorous geometry. It's very, very sophisticated. It's also technologically advanced in that it's constructed of exposed, poured-in-place reinforced concrete. And Unity Temple, with this use of material, was one of the first churches to be built from a material reserved typically for factories and warehouses. Wright designed two separate high skylit spaces, one for worship and one for the congregation's social gatherings. And here you can see in plan those two different spaces. And on the right you can see the Froebel block model, which reinforces to us the clarity of the geometric order in this period of Wright's work. And on the inside we can see in the detailing the repetitive and reuse of an organizing theme. And so, for example, the pattern in the skylights is mimicked in the detailing of the wood, of the paint, of the framing, of the trim, so that all of it is seen together as one artistic vocabulary. Again, quoting from his biography, Frank Lloyd Wright wanted desperately to work for Adler and Sullivan because they were, at this time in the Chicago area, seen as the ultimate moderns. They were building the early skyscrapers, or were about to, and the work they were doing was seen as very progressive and very American. And you'll notice here that he mentions the Froebel kindergarten education by name. So the next big influence for Wright is Louis Sullivan. So he had his job prospect with Adler and Sullivan, and they were at that time building Chicago's great auditorium theater. In his first job interview, Wright showed Sullivan not only his versions of the ornaments, but also his drawings of Sullivan's. Quoting his 1932 narrative, he says, that Sullivan's touch was like passion vine in full bloom, unquote. Once Sullivan and Adler saw the quality of his drafting, he was immediately hired to provide finished drawings for the auditorium building project. And Wright says, quote, "I became a good pencil in the master's hand, and at a time when he sorely needed one," unquote. Wright's drawings of ornament resembled those of Sullivan's so expertly that it would be impossible to tell them apart, except for the fact that the great bulk of Sullivan's works were lost in the upheavals of his own life. Tragically, only 200 pieces of Louis Sullivan's work are known to exist today. So for the young Frank Lloyd Wright, it's not surprising, given the level of ornamentation in the building, that additional draftspeople were needed, because hundreds of drawings were required. Sullivan incorporated brick, terracotta, marble, fine wood, gilding, glass mosaic, and tinted window glass. Again, Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. And so Frank Lloyd Wright came in and immediately grasped Sullivan's style so well that it did not take him long to work his way up to the foreman of the designer and supervisor of 30 draftsmen. And as he referred to himself as Sullivan's pencil, well, he would, for the rest of his life, call Louis Sullivan the Liebermeister, or master. Wright was so adept at not just drawing but designing that Sullivan had him take on the jobs of some residential commissions, including those for Sullivan's own use. The Astor Street house for James Charnley became a defining project for Wright and led him to an appreciation of the plain, unadorned walls. These projects became the ancestors of his later solo designs. And again, I think we can see some of the geometry of those Froebel blocks. Nearing the end of his contract, Wright left the firm of Adler and Sullivan after a dispute over some of the bootleg houses he had done on his own time. Unfortunately, the master and his pencil did not speak again for 12 years. I just want to show you, here's one of the decorative tiles for Chicago, designed by Louis Sullivan. A couple of things. Of course, Louis Sullivan said form follows function. Very important, hugely influential to Wright. The second very influential thing is Sullivan's explorations of ornamental schemes demonstrated the capacity for invention that's inherent in basic geometries. You can see here in this next image sort of the grammar of ornament. And Wright, as you can see in the series, the second on the lower level, the lower row here, Wright used a similar technique to develop his own designs at all levels of scale while maintaining this very clear aesthetic unity. So just a few things to sort of round out this influence of Louis Sullivan. He was the only architect whose influence Wright acknowledged. During the period that Wright worked for him, there are a number of important buildings that he worked on. And many have argued that Wright was less influenced by Sullivan's remarkable designs than by his philosophy and manner of thinking. And that is that form ever follows function, or the seeds of what will be organic design for Frank Lloyd Wright. And that is that the creation of architecture must be natural and intuitive, and evolve from and express the environment from which it grows. So it should grow organically from the needs of the program, the site, and the context. A couple of buildings, the start of the Prairie style period for Frank Lloyd Wright, immediately following his work with Louis Sullivan, as this home. This is the Winslow House in River Forest, Illinois. It was his first client when he opened his own architectural practice. And we can see this as an essential step in the development of the Prairie House, because it's here that Wright first developed those exterior forms and elevational concepts that would allow him then to start experimenting with the dynamic qualities of interior spaces. You'll notice, and we'll zoom in a minute, that the masonry elements bear and a remarkable affinity to the style of Louis Sullivan. While Roman brick is the basic material, there's also stone and plaster that are used here. And then there are these dark brown terracotta panels, which add to the horizontality of the project. You can see here some of the design of that terracotta should be very familiar just from looking at those few examples of Louis Sullivan. And it starts to introduce some of those features of the prairie style: low-hipped roof, broad central chimney, and deep overhanging eaves. And then from the arts and crafts movement, and this is specifically the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, or the total work of art, huge influence on Frank Lloyd Wright, but also the cult of domesticity. Wright saw the ideal home as a complete work of art in itself, and that this was an opportunity to craft, from the tea service to the home, to the siding, to the landscaping, and a wonderful place, say, to raise a family. A reminder of Gesamtkunstwerk, total design approach, and also the fact that form follows function from Louis Sullivan really feeds into this idea of the total work of art, and that Wright took this statement and added to it saying the unity of form and function is in good design. So the Roby House near the University of Chicago is considered one of the most important buildings of this period. And it shows some of the key features of the prairie style and is related to some of the other modern movements that we've seen going on. Here you can see some of the images, the narrow brick to accentuate those long horizontal lines, the very deep cantilevering eaves, the clear-story windows, which create those long horizontal bands. These are grounded structures touching down on the earth, not lifting off. It's also very private because it was on an urban lot. You can see that's right up against the sidewalk. And Wright masterfully creates a series of barriers so that someone on the sidewalk cannot look into the main dwelling spaces of the home. Here you can see some of the interior design. Again, as we saw with Louis Sullivan and Wright's work with that firm, every detail here, from the leaded glass in the doors, to the light fixtures, to the furniture, to the trim within the house, is all related in its aesthetic intent. The next category that is fundamental to the development of Frank Lloyd Wright's work is nature. And I'm going to just give you this quote because it does a better job than explaining than I do. Quote, "Nature is my manifestation of God. I go to nature every day for inspiration in the day's work. I follow in building the principles which nature has used in its domain." Unquote. So from nature he abstracted patterns and forms. His mother, Anna Wright, had instilled in her son a love of nature's beauty, but also of its variety. He had spent time at his uncle's farm growing up, and we know later at Taliesin he had working farms and had his fellows working right in the ground to build things. So Wright had a huge appreciation for immersion in nature. Wright also appreciated music, and this was a constant appreciation for his work. And later, after working with Louis Sullivan, we also see the idea of the use of geometry and abstractions from nature to create those patterns, those designs that become sort of mainstays within his domestic and institutional designs. And this quote is very important. When we think of organic today, we're inclined to think of, say, organic groceries or food. When we talk about Frank Lloyd Wright being an organic architect, it emerges from this quote where he says, quote, "A building is only organic when the exterior and the interior exist in unison, and when both are in harmony with the character and nature of its purpose, its reason for existence, its location, and the time of its creation, unquote. So I think in that one quote we can see the Gesamtkunstwerk, but also the zeitgeist. The spirit of the age needs to be addressed. Japan was another important influence in Frank Lloyd Wright's work. As an architect, art dealer, and designer, Frank Lloyd Wright was greatly inspired by the art and culture of Japan. His 1893 visit to Japan's National Pavilion at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago had a lasting and dramatic effect on the young architect. He first went to Japan in 1905, and he returned from that trip with a large selection of prints, many of which he intended to sell. Later, he resided in Japan while working on Tokyo's Imperial Hotel. This gave him a chance to deepen his appreciation of Japanese culture and nature, as seen in the woodblock prints that he had collected and loved. While he did not return to Japan after the hotel's completion in 1922, we do know that he continued to collect and sell Japanese woodblock prints until his death in 1959. In this series of analytical drawings, you can see comparative elevations of the shrine that was at the Columbian Exposition and the Winslow Homer House. And you'll notice the strong horizontal lines, the pitch of the roof, and then of course the wall profile is particularly striking. And I love this quote. He says, "At last I have found one country on earth where simplicity as nature is supreme." And in his project for Tokyo's Imperial Hotel, he lived and worked there, and he had the opportunity to learn more about Japanese prints. The Imperial Hotel, which we can see here, sadly has since been destroyed, but we can see that linear simplicity and the spatial fluidity that he admired in Japanese architecture, as well as, of course, his own hand in the project. Here's some old postcards. One important Eastern influence can be found in the consistent way in which Wright emphasizes the extension of space from building interior to exterior, and how he organizes the entry sequence to his houses. The skillful way in which he redirects movements, slows the pace, and prepares one for the climactic experience of arrival at the central space of the house is something that he seems to maybe have borrowed from Japanese tradition. It's reminiscent of both Japanese garden design and the entry sequence to a Japanese temple. Wright's work demonstrates a proclivity for transformational rather than radical chance, which demonstrates his allegiance to type. So ultimately we do see his work unfold as a variation on themes. And then from Maya Lin, regarding the Japanese tradition. And I think it's interesting here that, again, her quote focuses on the connection between inside and outside. In this case, at what height you place your window and how your gaze can exit the building. Now, we've talked a bit about Frank Lloyd Wright and the influences on his work. And now we're just going to go quickly through some of the theory and writings that were important through his career. He wrote many books, just showing you a few here. He had an active mind. He spoke. He was invited to give talks in various places. And of course, he was a teacher in that he had his own fellowship program at Taliesin. In 1908, he published this manifesto called In the Cause of Architecture. And in his declaration, Wright divulges a contemporary analysis of the Prairie School, what he referred to as the New School of the Middle West. Wright's architectural theories are outlined through personal anecdotes of various commissions and clients. 20 years later, in 1928, Wright would publish 8 more articles of architectural declaration under the name in the cause of architecture in the architectural record. So here are some of the things he has written. I'm just quoting a few parts. Wright opens in the cause of architecture with a testament to the importance of nature in architecture. We begin also in this volume to see Wright using the words like organic to describe his theories. He also refers back to propositions and designs. These few, which I urge you to read, help to kind of get into his mind and understand how he's placing his designs in the world. I think number 3, of course, is key to his idea of this organic architecture. A building should appear to grow easily from its site and be shaped to harmonize with its surroundings, if nature is manifest there. And a few other quotes. He also, as part of the In the Cause of Architecture, sort of lays out what the prairie style principles would be. And these are recapped as this. He describes organic design process of his prairie houses, and even though the term prairie school would not be coined until later in the century, he does have photographs which were published alongside in the architectural record version of the manifesto, and he identifies different prairie expressions based on roof composition. And here are some of these: low pitched roof, overhanging eaves, horizontal lines, central chimney, open floor plan, and clear story windows. Another very important publication is the Wasmuth Portfolio of 1909. So what happened is Wright had arranged a publication deal with a Berlin publisher, Ernst Wasmuth, to produce the definitive architectural monograph of his career to date. Still quite early in his career. This was meant to be called the Wasmuth Portfolio, and it ultimately was produced, finally printed in 1910 when Wright was only 43 years old. Utilizing the few renderers remaining in his studio, as well as one of his own sons, Wright feverishly reproduced idealized versions of his best prairie works for the high-quality lithographs to be used in the 2-volume portfolio. As a collector of Japanese woodblock prints, Wright tried to approximate a similar aesthetic in his monograph. Each of the plates showing a perspective in a natural landscape, a detail, or a floor plan was to be a complete story of a building that could stand alone as an art object. The completed work remains his greatest ensemble of illustration art. The Japanese print most likely led to his use of the outlined foliage that breaks the frame line itself. The main difference we see here is the use of the Western 2-point perspective instead of the Japanese tradition of 1-point and isometric perspective. And this is what it would look like. Now, I had mentioned in earlier lectures how in Peter Barron's studio there had been a great excitement when the work of Frank Lloyd Wright was published. Well, this is the volume that I'm referring to. When the portfolio arrived on the drafting boards of European modernists, it was a huge sensation, inspiring already gifted architects to transformations of their own. Sharing the same Berlin office of Peter Barron's and discovering this work together were Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and a young man who would later be known as Le Corbusier. And so this particular portfolio and the style of these illustrations, the designs that are shown here, primarily prairie style, were hugely influential. This is important because often we think that the influence of modernism came from Europe to the United States, and certainly it did. But I think you can see that as early as 1909, there were in fact influences going both ways. It was a two-way street. Here's another panel from the Wasmuth Portfolio. This is not a written treatise, but it expresses its thesis plainly and seductively. Most of the principles of modern architecture were inspired by principles illustrated in the Wadsworth portfolio. And it's through this volume, in fact, that he's introduced to most of those European designers. I do want to just quickly mention here Marion Mahoney. Mahoney's drawings, retraced in ink, formed much of what became known as the Wadsworth portfolio, a compendium, of course, of Wright's designs. Tragically, very few of the original Wadsworth portfolios exist today. Many were destroyed in the fire at Taliesin, and others have been lost to time. Individual plates are rare and complete volumes rarer still. The rarest of all was sold in the mid-1990s, bearing Wright's handwritten dedication on the title page. To mein Liebermeister, from his Frank Lloyd Wright. In the space after Liebermeister, the recipient himself carefully wrote in Louis H. Sullivan. In 1932, Frank Lloyd Wright authored an essay entitled The Disappearing City, in which he proposed a solution that he called the Broadacre City. This utopian concept was not a formal commission, but rather one of Frank Lloyd Wright's many organic concepts of architecture that he envisioned. It is widely known that Frank Lloyd Wright loathed classical architecture and its repetition on American soil. That is what led him to develop the prairie mode of domestic architecture. Beyond his distaste of European revival was the modern-day city. When Wright first arrived in Chicago in the spring of 1887, he lamented on the squalor of the city conditions. The pollution bothered him. The traffic irritated him. The advertisements annoyed him. And man was not entitled to any freedom of space or, subsequently, any individuality. So all of these things that he didn't like about the city brought him to the central notion of decentralization, which became known as the Broadacre City. The fundamental core idea of the Broadacre City is that every man has 1 acre of land for living. An acre of land for a man and his family was sufficient enough for them to live by. This would be accomplished by the decentralization of cities over spans of hundreds of miles. Rather than one large city crammed with millions of people, there would now be dozens of sprawling cities, with those millions evenly distributed. This is an idealistic merge of urban and rural, but it was really not meant to be suburban, because each of these little centers would be self-sufficient. It's interesting to note that his obsession with the Broadacre City design really emerged when he was 61 years old. And he was not, of course, the only architect scheming to fix the modern city. We have, of course, the Garden City from Ebenezer Howard. We have around the same time Le Corbusier's urban plans, which we'll look at a little bit more next week. And in fact, Broadacre City was fully branded in 1932 when the New York Times magazine invited Wright to respond to an article they had published by Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier's article had proposed a grand urban scheme called the Radiant City, which, as you know, is all vertical towers in the park. Very different from Broadacre City that Frank Lloyd Wright would propose. And here we can see a model of the Broadacre City. This was built by the Taliesin Fellows, and Frank Lloyd Wright traveled with the model and gave talks about the benefit of this disappearing city. And here we can see some other images. Along with the urban planning, we can also see some of the sort of vehicles that he is proposing. Very utopian, some of it even a little fantastical. But it was a full proposal. One of the most important aspects of the Broadacre City was the Usonian house concept, because on these acreages, everyone would have their own, every American family would be able to have their own home. And so the Usonian house is sort of hatched as this proper environment for the Broadacre city. And Usonian comes from the idea of utopian and US, United States. And Wright felt this would be eminently democratic. And so here are some other images. Usonian after the United States. It's a single story built on a monolithic concrete slab and joined to a carport, so not a garage. Wright believed that this could be replicated for $5,000 across the country, so that anyone who wanted it could have an architect-designed home for $5,000. Here are some of the concepts. You'll notice that the features in the left column are shared with the prairie style, and then on the right we have some other features that are distinct to the Usonian house, specifically the use of inexpensive materials, more built-in components, and zoned plans, because this is a smaller home. The Herbert Jacobs House 1 in Madison, Wisconsin, we can see this here. It's L-shaped, opening onto a private yard. You'll notice on the inside there's one large great room right after a kind of compressed narrow entry. And then the upper part of the L in the plan here is where the bedrooms and studies, some more private spaces, are located. The hinge between the two arms, the public and private, is the kitchen and dining area. You'll notice this wall of windows looking out onto the garden. And then in the image on the bottom right, you can see the clear story windows and the built-in furniture and shelving, all very common features of the Usonian house. Here you get a sense of that long horizontal line. These buildings, again, really rooted in the earth. Warm materials, those deep overhangs. You can see the clear story from the outside here, so very private for the homeowner, but opening up the wall on the private garden side. The brick and wood construction, and of course the glass curtain wall, suggested simplicity and also a harmony with nature. Some of the later Usonian houses do become a bit more complex, but this Herbert Jacobs house, the first one, is considered sort of the most pure example of that Usonian ideal. Okay, I've mentioned organic architecture a couple of times, and what is it? From Louis Sullivan, of course, form follows function, and Frank Lloyd Wright uses the term organic very specifically, and we can see that it's with modern materials, mastering of the machine, and the way that he interprets and makes space. So in his prairie houses, Frank Lloyd Wright first began to do this by expanding the windows. Instead of having gaps within the windows, he positioned them as ribbons. They're interconnected and separated by only thin partitions. Eventually, they would make up almost ribbon-like windows. And this elimination of the wall, or breaking up of the box, as Wright called it, allowed for a new form of interior freedom that had not been seen before. In the Larkin building, we see the interior space opened up with that massive atrium and the skylight above. If we were to encapsulate some of these organic architecture ideas, we first mentioned that he introduced the word organic into his philosophy as early as 1908. It was, as I've already mentioned, an extension of the teachings of his mentor, Louis Sullivan, whose slogan, "Form follows function," became the mantra of modern architecture. Although the word organic in common usage refers to animals and plants, Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture is not a style of imitation, because he does not claim to be building forms which are representative of nature. Instead, organic architecture is a reinterpretation of nature's principles as they have been filtered through the intelligent minds of men and women. Organic architecture involves a respect for the properties of the material. You don't twist steel into a flower, right? No, that would be inappropriate. So an organic architecture is also an attempt to integrate spaces into a coherent whole, a marriage between the site and the structure, and a union between context and structure. Throughout his 70-year career, Frank Lloyd Wright published articles, gave lectures, and wrote many books, and this philosophy of organic architecture was present consistently in his body of work. And there are three key ways that organic architecture can be viewed as a philosophy rather than a style. And so the three basic tenets are the nature of the site, nature of the clients, and nature of the materials. So let's look at these quickly. Nature of site can translate as respecting local traditions and designing a building that uses local materials. It may also mean a structure that frames landscape views or takes advantage of an unusual site. One example of the responses to landscape is Wright's design of Taliesin West. The building incorporates locally collected freestanding rocks and boulders that form the main building material. In addition, Wright specified the use of rocks found on his property that contained petroglyphs carved into them by indigenous people. These rocks are placed in specific areas and situated in their own original compass orientations. And here you can see how the building is integrated into the site. We can see too where nature is allowed to run wild and where the architecture and planning begins to assert itself more fully, but yet there's this continuous integration. At Taliesin West, the architecture is an extension of the desert. The building appears to rise organically from the ground, and the integration of site, nature, and architecture is really undeniable. The primary structural component of Taliesin West is comprised of what Frank Lloyd Wright called desert masonry, a collection of rocks and pebbles gathered from the site, set into a cast and held together with desert sand and local cement. These casts were used over and over again to set in place in the desert masonry, and every wall in the complex is supported in this way. The roofs were made of stretched canvas, allowing a soft, delicate light to brighten the interiors. Moving to the organic architecture quality of needs of the client. This can be interpreted in the most practical terms. How much room does the family need? Where do they like to gather? What is going to happen in these spaces? However, Wright also considered how the structure could enhance the family's activities or institutional activities and to elevate the use of that space into art. Falling water is famously placed over a waterfall that was beloved by the clients, the Kaufmans. Once the home was built, the Kaufmans could no longer see the waterfall unless they left their home. However, the sound of the waterfall became a part of their daily experience of the building. The placement, the fact that the Kaufmans could no longer see the water, was actually ultimately a source of tension between the client and the designer in this case. Here you can see the images of falling water. Again, the use of local material combined with concrete. And that cantilever over the waterfall itself. And a reminder of that quote from Frank Lloyd Wright, "A building is only organic when the exterior and the interior exist in unison." I think this is something that clearly he was striving for in the design of falling water. Another interesting example of meeting client needs in novel ways is seen in Wright's institutional architecture. This is the Johnson & Sons Administration Building, and it's one of Wright's most important statements about the nature of office buildings. He was commissioned to design a worldwide headquarters for the family company, and the exterior walls, you can see here, are non-load bearing and were constructed using a red brick. Other materials used in the construction of the Johnson Wax building include red Kasota sandstone and reinforced concrete, with cool-drawn mesh used for reinforcement. He also designed over 200 different shapes of bricks that can be found in the building. The earthy colors he used included his signature Cherokee red color, which were typical in Wright's work at the time. In fact, we also saw the Cherokee red in Falling Water. The most identifiable element are the dendriform columns, the name used by Wright because of their tree-like shape. Wright's ability to effortlessly incorporate the organic metaphor into his architecture can be seen in these tall, slender mushroom columns that taper to a base of a mere 9-inch in diameter. They rise 30 feet and terminate at the roof level as broad circular lily pads of concrete, 18.5 feet wide. Wright's imagination led to creating these hollow core columns that serve as stormwater drains, and also the spaces between the lily pads as skylights. The skylight was made using Pyrex glass tubing. Pyrex was a new material at the time, another reminder that Wright was always looking to use new materials and new technologies in his work. Regarding addressing the needs of the client, this particular space formed a large workspace, nearly 1/2 acre in size. The great room, as it is referred to, is furnished with specific Wright-designed pieces, 2 circular elevators, and a mezzanine. Wright wanted to provide a complete design for this building, created over 40 pieces of furniture, and tried to elevate the office environment for the worker. And here we can see some of the other detail, some more use of the Pyrex glass tubing to allow light into the space. Frank Lloyd Wright was quoted in the Racine Times describing the Johnson administration building as, quote, simply and sincerely an interpretation of modern business conditions, designed to be as inspiring to live in and work in as any cathedral ever was to worship in. And then finally, the nature of materials. This extends beyond the use of local materials to include the respect for the materials themselves. As Wright wrote in 1908 in an article entitled In the Cause of Architecture, quote, bring out the nature of materials. Always let their nature intimately into your scheme. Strip the wood of varnish and greasy paint. Let it alone or stain it. Develop the natural texture of the plastering and stain it. Reveal the nature of the wood, plaster, brick, or stone in your designs. They are all by nature friendly and beautiful. Unquote. And here we can see at the V.C. Morris gift shop the use of brick, the patterning. It becomes the ornament, the tonal shades of the natural fired brick. They also the use of concrete and plaster define the curve of that ramp on the inside of the V.C. Morris gift shop. This was a physical prototype or proof of concept for the circular ramp that he would later use at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, which you see here. And so, an organic architecture that is meeting programmatic needs, that uses materials in an expressive way, and that addresses uniquely the needs of the client. These are what made up organic architecture for Frank Lloyd Wright. And looking across the Guggenheim, you can also add to that the making of a unique space, the sort of which had never been seen before, yet rooted in a historical understanding, in this case, of how the art museum worked. Above all else, Wright's vision served beauty. When he quibbled with Sullivan's dictum that form follows function, suggesting that form and function are one, he was in fact revealing that when push came to shove, his true passion was form more than function. What he admired in the arts and crafts movement was its commitment to crafting all objects in such a way as to render them beautiful. What he loved about Japan was the idea of a culture in which every human action and every human object were integrated, so as to make an entire civilization a work of art. In pursuit of beauty, Wright sought to subordinate all elements of his architecture to a consistent style that would express their underlying unity. No matter how radically his individual buildings may differ from each other, they all express his struggle for aesthetic consistency, his habit of seizing a single abstract theme and recapitulating it with endless variety.